Now, the plan is following. I will very briefly introduce the topic again, maybe for those who are not that aware of the topic overselling and corresponding adjustment, but I will not go into details because the topic is way too broad and specific. I take it that the audience is competent in that sense. And I will direct then, or I will finish my presentation with leading question, and introduce then the questions to the panel. We have 3 panelists, and I'm very, very happy to have them here on board. The webcast will be quite practical in the sense that we do have these studies, a lot of thoughts about the complex on overselling and so on. But what's now in the focus much more is the question: what does it do with countries? What does it do with project developers? We are in urgent need for action, and does it impede the action, or does it inform a better and more robust process going forward? In the panel, we have Fenella Aouane from the Global Green Growth Institute. She's in Seoul right now. It's 11 p.m. and I'm very, very glad that she's here without the opportunity for serving coffee in this virtual meeting. And she will represent a multilateral organization who is very much involved in engaging with countries on this journey, not only under Article 6, but in the context of Article 13 and the Paris Agreement in general. Then second, we have Urs Brodmann, who is with First Climate. It's a project developer who is quite heavily involved in developing concrete Article 6 activities, among others. So he's a good person to give inputs into the perspective of a project developer review on this overselling topic. And then I'm very, very glad to have a country representative from Chile, Juan Pedro Searle, from the Ministry of Energy in Chile, and he's he has to leave a little bit earlier because he's also involved in the negotiations that are going on right now. I introduced the Padlet very briefly. We are talking about this study. The study identified options to or strategies to mitigate the risk of overselling. You have these in color, these columns, and there you have the possibility to leave a rating. Which one is the most preferred, in your view, the most preferred option to mitigate the risk for overselling? And you have on the right-hand side 2 columns where you can just add new sticky notes. This is very simple. You don't have to register. Just go to the link and add a new sticky note. That's basically all. So let's jump directly into the topic. Now, about overselling, this is a very funny display. It's a marginal abatement cost curve of Switzerland from the perspective back in 2012. And this basically shows a concept, how we can think about, from a country perspective, to reach the NDC. You have a number of mitigation measures, technologies, etc., that are rated in terms of potential and in terms of costs. Some are negative costs, some are positive costs, but basically these are the options a country faces to reach its NDC. And they may, for example, identify a number of measures they want to follow up to reach the NDC ambition, maybe A, B, C, D, E. Nuclear power is out for various reasons, so that's it. That's what we call, or what the the term that was introduced probably by the study, which is very helpful, the NDC package. This is the strategy of a country on how reaching the targets pledged under the Paris Agreement. Now, what happens if Article 6 involvement leads to a situation where, for example, part of the measure D is used for transfer and cannot be accounted by the country towards its own mitigation achievements. So what happens, they have to make it up somewhere, and this will be basically at the margin the next more expensive basically mitigation option that is available. This is due to the fact that the country has corresponding adjustments obligations, and they have to make it up at some place. And following this logic, this place would be a measure that costs more than it would have cost if they did the ITMO part on their own. And this is what we call the risk of overselling, selling the table silver, or there are different terms to that, selling the cheapest mitigation options. And now the study identifier had a broad a series of interviews and literature review to find options and strategies against it. And basically they found like three broader strategies. First, to avoid overlaps with the NDC package. Second, to share mitigation outcomes that are between the country and the like buyer in a way, and then pricing techniques to safeguard the opportunities. And again, on the top corresponding adjustment, if the corresponding adjustments are in scale higher than the mitigation outcomes reduced as reflected in the NDC, then this leads to a situation where they have to make it up or offset with an additional measures. And if these measures are more expensive, then the country runs into an inferior situation. And this is basically the risk in short. So looking at these strategies, the first section, the avoiding section, looks quite straightforward. To avoid overlap with measures from the NDC package, that's quite obvious, but also a country could design measures that are simply inaccessible to them because it's complicated or expensive. Another option would be to introduce a cost threshold. This is again a bit linked to the positive list, but more, it's not a positive list, but it's a cost threshold, but it's ultimately targeting the same. Or fourth, to have or to introduce an NDC trajectory in a sector or in a subsector, and anything that goes beyond and above in terms of mitigation action could be credited. Then the second set of strategies refers to sharing the mitigation outcomes. This could be by simple division, leaving part of the mitigation outcome for use or in the transferring country. There is also the option to limit the crediting period to allow sustained mitigation outcome accrual after the crediting period ends to stay within the transferring country for the benefit of the country. And then again, a conservative baseline, in my view, is a bit similar than the baseline before the NDC trajectory, but not based on the NDC, but based on a science-based target, which is in line with the aim of the Paris Agreement. And ultimately, transfers could also be made conditional on reaching the NDC or securing some stage gates, positive stage gates. And then thirdly, this is the idea that to make up the marginal costs that will accrue later after when a country sees that they're not reaching the NDC and have to do additional measures at higher costs. This could be achieved in two ways, either through levying the transaction to build up a reserve fund, or to have a two-step pricing whereby one price refers to the mitigation activity and another set of price goes to the host country to cover up future costs to offset any risk for overselling. So these are basically the options. The study also showed quite clearly that there are trade-offs in terms of effectivity and administrative burden, and also scalability, specifically effectivity of the strategy. The more effective, the more burdensome it is. And it also showed that it is very important with respect going forward with Article 6 to have a very clear idea of the NDC package, because only then the importance of conscious decisions towards Article 6 are possible. Good. And also diversity of strategies. You can, of course, mix these different strategies. Good. Now with this, I'd like to open up the whole discussion. I put here to ease a little bit the discussion, and this slide will stick throughout the discussions. And I would like to open up the question to the participants. And I'd like to start actually with Juan Pedro with the question, within all these strategies and techniques, so to say, what's your first take back from such a layout, and what would be your most preferable, so to say, your most preferred strategies to avoid overselling?
Super, thank you, Misha. First, I would like to say that this is a very interesting analysis. This is the type of analysis that or studies that we should conduct in our countries. This is crucial. And I recall that some of the questions that you posted in the email regarding if countries like Chile or others are really trying now to resolve this type of issues. Yes, we are engaged in this, and sometimes not having a straight answer to which type of strategy to avoid overselling we're going to use. I think we'll miles behind taking those decisions. So I guess part of this prevent us to move forward with Article 6 pilots, because we want to have more basis to take decisions. And I would say if you can think a little bit earlier, I think the risk of overselling, of course, is our main preoccupation. But before that is to really learn how Article 6 will have a role in our long-term goal, because we have one. So we think it could be like maybe I don't know, like we're trying to think in 2050 and not just 2030, 2035, 2040 when we'll have a, and this is more ambitious, because this is not about just the NDC in 2030, and I think you said it pretty well in one of the options. I think it's the one that links the long-term strategies and the use of Article 6. And when you do that, I think the list option that we would use is to have a negative list. Because when I read the paper, and please correct me if I'm wrong, when I read the paper, like one assumes from the beginning that we will use Article 6 only in those activities that are not under the NDC radar. And I think that we can maybe expand a little bit that approach and to really use Article 6 for, you know, at least in two approaches. One, to help us in reaching the NDC, and I'll explain that. And the second one, to help us in increasing our ambition over time. And for the first one, and I think it'll be nice for future iteration of this work that you're doing, is to really understand the use of Article 6 in the context of the NDCs. Why? Because Article 6 could also maybe advance the measures that you have under the NDC. So there's no mentioning here about that role that Article 6 could play. So when we are thinking on Article 6, for instance, in the electricity sector, where many things are happening in Chile, and renewable energy is every day is cheaper than coal or natural gas, then you ask yourself, this is happening not because of Article 6 or carbon pricing, it's happening because of different reasons and maybe different policies. But we want Article 6 to have a role there. So why not think on Article 6 that could, you know, advance, you know, our schedule could be advanced as compared to the regional planning. And on the other hand, there is an option which I like very much, the one that you call inaccessible technologies. But I would say that one is also, that one should not also be outside the scope of the NDC. We have done a lot of research. We have a fairly good projection of different measures for Chile for 2050. And of course, for the current new NDC that we have. And we see that, that of course, we will try to put in place all this low cost, you know, negative cost measures. We have a MAC curve in place now, but at the same time, we feel that Article 6 could have a role in trying to, you know, finance part of the burden that we need for those measures that are, you know, above the axis, you know.
Okay.
So my main takeaway from this analysis that you have done, this is, I mean, this is very much needed, and it also put us in a situation that, I mean, when I read it once again yesterday, because I read it like 3 or 4 weeks ago when it was released, or 2 months ago, I don't know, but I read it again, and I asked myself, wow, this is something that we should try to explore here in Chile, and try to analyze all these options. And I'm happy that at the end of the paper, you said it very clearly that these options can be combined. So it's not just one versus the other, but they can be combined.
Okay.
So yeah, so the least one is the negative list. And I guess there's a combination of other ones. For instance, I guess the share of mitigation outcomes generated is a good one. But of course, how to express that share, the amount, in order not to prevent, you know, the potential buyer to, you know, to
But if I understand you, correctly, you really look at this as a long-term exercise, a bit also organic, maybe, to start with a negative list, and maybe coupled or mixed a bit with positive lists, where you say, well, we also want to some extent to target inaccessible technologies. But it all stands in a much broader framework, reaching or aiming at 2050. And now the question is only, how do you go about this practically? Do you wait until you have the full picture for 2050, or is there a middle ground to start with? And this is maybe also then question I would, in the after your answer, to direct to Fenella, because she's working with the countries that might not be so, or some countries that might be not so advanced in the thinking process as Chile is.
Right. So you want me to react
Yeah,
to that one?
exactly. And then Fenella, maybe.
Yeah, I guess one answer to that could be through pilots. So you can use pilot to try to understand, you know, these different options. I guess I expressed myself a little bit maybe wrong in the context of this negative list. I don't think that would be an option here, because as you said it very clearly in one of the examples, which is very interesting. You can have, for instance, under the NDC, like a goal of, let's say, X% of penetration of clean energy, but then you will be limited to create ITMOs from the rest of the, you know, of the penetration velocity. You see what I mean? So we have to think very carefully in having a negative list. In terms of the positive list, you're right. We're trying to aim Article 6 to really try to, you know, as I said at the beginning, to advance the penetration of high-cost technologies. But that doesn't mean necessarily that these options are out of the NDC. So I like to see this more, as you said, in the long run. I think we limit ourselves if we just think this is out of the NDC, this is in the NDC, because that discussion, I don't know. I think it's a bit limiting, but it's interesting to have all these options on the table.
Okay, good, excellent. So I think that's a very good initial response. And now over to Fenella. Other countries that might not be so far in thinking about 2050 and climate change issues. What's your experience working with these countries? Do they also perceive the risk of or the use of Article 6 and the eventual risks related to it in the context of the overall NDC in a similar way?
Thanks, Misha, and really interesting comments there from Juan Pedro. I think it's a mixture. Some are really quite aware of Article 6 and have participated. Quite often they've maybe been part of other carbon pricing initiatives, whether that's a carbon taxing system or part of the PMR or something similar. So they've kind of got the idea of pricing carbon and looking at the possibility of transactions, whereas others are obviously a little earlier. But I mean, I noticed Juan Pedro's comments about, you know, we're still early in this stage and we don't know which measure we're looking at. We want to achieve the NDC. How does Article 6 help us increase ambition, which is obviously a key point? And, you know, maybe I call the categories that you're looking at slightly differently, because it's, you know, the first category is you limit the activities or the volume that you sell. So one idea is, okay, so we've said we will do solar in our NDC. So you have a negative list and you say, okay, we won't sell any solar because solar we can do ourselves. But of course, solar you can do yourselves up to a point, but then suddenly you find up in the highlands or more inaccessible areas or further away from grid, smaller size, other areas is still solar, but they're more expensive. So in fact, does the negative list actually allow you to not only achieve the NDC, but go further? So you could find yourself limiting possibilities of trade with a negative list. A positive list, we know, for example, Peru has been investigating a positive list, that with the specific idea of bringing in new technology. Your cost of technology changes though, so you have to keep that, I mean, call it organic, call it dynamic. You have to keep an eye on your list and make sure that your list isn't kind of going out of time or out of step with the cost of technology. There's also the idea of needing to know how much things cost and needing to know what your activities are in your NDC. So, you know, I think the comment from Chile is clearly their list of activities in the NDC is quite clear, but many countries put a list of activities in their NDC as a sort of, well, this is what we can think of at the moment, but it might be completely different. So just simply saying not those activities won't suit. I think baselines are obvious. You're going to have to choose a baseline, and choosing a baseline of business as usual is not functional. So I think on that limiting the quantity, having a baseline would and then you've got to decide where are you going to have it. Are you going to have it at unconditional NDC? Are you going to have it at conditional NDC? Are you going to put a buffer for when you maybe change your NDC? Where are you going to set it? But it's all fairly related to the NDC because the jury's out as to whether, whether you,
Yeah. Okay. So if I understand that correctly, so countries are the countries you are working with, they don't, or they as well don't perceive it. I mean, it somehow it resembles a bit Juan Pedro's perspective. That is, I mean, it's not about lines in a diagram. It's really much more into the question what role could Article 6 activities and the funding of the activities play in the broader context. And so this context could be as well quite case specific. A country could simply try to understand what's like our need in a moment going forward to promote certain things they couldn't do. Is that correct, or?
I think it's clear that countries want to use Article 6 to be able to do more, to finance more than they would do on their own. Where you take that, what is more from, is your baseline. The what more, how much more, is less important at the moment. That's the generation of the pipeline. But it is to increase ambition. And I again, just to say, I think you use all three of these categories together because you need, you know, sharing is obviously one very strong way to avoid overselling, or at least spread the risk, because that's a risk sharing of overselling. And the last area of a cost compensation, there will need to be some level of levy anyway for countries to be able to administer the management of their NDC and constantly keep a watch on whatever they've sold. So I think there's a black cross.
Excellent. Yeah. So speaking of pipeline, I mean, that's the perfect invitation to Urs to give his perspective, because after all, this is not the menu in a restaurant where you just can pick and choose. In the end, these activities have to be implemented and operated, and ultimately the question is whether or not there is a business case to it, and how could we organize what kind of participation criteria, eligibility criteria could be attached to deliver both a bankable, viable business model and safeguarding environmental integrity and also the risk for overselling. And here, Urs, I'd like to invite you to present your perspective, also bearing in mind you're like over a decade in the market, very active, and we have seen a lot of activities that in the past were like mitigation activities under the CDM and have become now in certain areas like government action or government programs. So there seems to be also a propagation in the whole thing. And but at the beginning there is a project developer and an entrepreneur.
Well, thank you, Misha. Thank you also for having me on this webinar. Let me start out by telling you my conviction, or our conviction at First Climate, and I think that ties in nicely with what Juan, Pedro and Fenella have already said. We are convinced at First Climate that a good Article 6 activity must also help the host country achieve its NDC. It must contribute to the achievement of the NDC target. So it cannot be just a zero-sum game where the host country benefits from co-benefits, even though they may be very substantial. You know, the classical, you know, reduced local pollution, but also benefits in terms of price discovery. For example, what are the abatement costs? Also benefits in terms of data collection. Right, these are important co-benefits, but in the end, each Article 6 activity must also deliver a contribution towards a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that the host country can count towards its own target. Otherwise, you know, that's our experience. It will be very hard to gain the acceptance of the key stakeholders in those host country, in particular those ministries that have the job of getting the NDC implemented. And these are typically the people that also, you know, have a leading role in dealing and approving with Article 6 activities. Now, already to also emphasize, you know, at First Climate, we find that, and that's also based on the experience of the last 2 decades, that the crediting period will have an important role in delivering just that, in making sure that a portion of the emission reductions that are achieved by a mitigation activity remain in the host country and can be counted towards the NDC. I.e., after a certain number of years, a project will continue to operate, you know, if it is a good project, and that's a requirement. And after that crediting period where ITMOs are transferred to the buyer country, the project will continue to operate and contribute to the NDC. Now, how do we achieve that net contribution to the NDC? You know, firstly, we have to make sure that an activity is additional not only to business as usual, but also to the policies that the host country puts in place to achieve the NDC. So you use the term, Misha, of an NDC trajectory, right? And that already shows that policy instruments will be phased in over time. And simply because something is stated in the NDC does not render an activity non-additional, right? As long as there is no policy instrument to actually transform the NDC into practice in a given sector. So that's the first requirement, additional to business as usual, and the NDC implementation policies. The second requirement we find is that sharing of the reductions, and I've already said that the crediting period, short crediting periods in our view are a key tool to achieve that, and it's also a tool that was highlighted in the report that you have presented. And we prefer that over, say, conservative baselines for reasons we can go into if necessary. A third important requirement then is that we have to make sure that the emission reductions achieved by a mitigation activity actually show up in the national inventory, right? And that's not self-evident, because we all know that national inventories have their limitations, but at the same time, it's certainly manageable to make sure that this is the case. And fourth, we then have to make sure that the corresponding adjustment that the host country has to make does not actually exceed the emission reductions that are shown in the inventory, right? And that's also not self-evident when we look at the detailed rules for the corresponding adjustments. But that's a technical story I'm not going to go into for now. So overall, we find that making sure that an activity contributes to the NDC is a manageable task, you know, looking at the 4 points that I said. And that also means by turning that statement around, we find that the risk of preventing an overselling is an absolutely manageable task, both at the level of the individual activities and also at an aggregate level, right? And there I'd like to point to a fairly, well, just when we look at the aggregate demand for ITMOs out there, or for example, from Switzerland, you know, we find that for the time being, we see it as highly unlikely that Article 6 activities would really, you know, reach a scale where due to overselling, a host country then actually fails to reach its NDC. Yeah, and now coming to the question, what strategies to take to make these cases happen in reality? You know, a lot has been said about risks. You know, we prefer to put the focus more on the opportunities, right? The opportunity being that in the short term now, countries such as Switzerland have put a substantial amount of money on the table that is available for purchase of ITMOs. And at the same time, emerging economies and developing countries, they are in the process of you know, translating the NDC into actual policies to reduce emissions, and that will take time. And I would like to just refer to the history where Switzerland, for example, took 11 years to come up with or introduce a carbon tax, right? After Kyoto, December 1997 adopted, and it was only in 2008 that Switzerland adopted a carbon tax. EU likewise introduced 8 years after Kyoto, introduced an emissions trading scheme, but that was substantially over allocated in 2005. And only in 2008, 11 years later, we had an emissions trading scheme that actually had teeth, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the expectations that emerging economies would now in 2021 have a complete package of policy instruments in place to reduce emissions and achieve their NDC, that's simply not realistic and not fair, right? There will be a trajectory, there will be a phase of you know, phasing in policy instruments and ramping them up, and at the same time that creates a window of opportunity also to use Article 6 to push, you know, kickstart certain activities that can later on be supported also by these policy instruments. So I see there, you know, a clear synergy that can be harnessed rather than a risk.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah.
I think I'll leave it at that to give the others also a chance to comment. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's really very interesting, and also I think it ties in nicely with what Juan Pedro and Fenella were talking about from the perspective of the countries, that it is most probably a long shot. It's the Paris Agreement is about Article 16 30 much more than 6. It's about the contribution of the countries in Article 6. So that I mean, it has been negotiated very late into the text, and so it is maybe more an element that needs to find its place in the overall context, and it might take longer. But the question is, what do we do in the intermediate time up until 2030? And that's of course the perspective that is important to me, to us, to the KliK Foundation, also to Switzerland, that aims at creating through Article 6 and cooperation with other countries additional ambition under Article 6. How to go about that when these like convergence towards a clear picture is not yet done. And so my takeaway from you three panelists is that there needs to be a very custom-tailored approach that shows the benefits for all sides, and the benefits also could be could come in not only in the form of co-benefits and funds and taxes, but also in terms of real contributions towards the NDC in terms of not counted or not credited mitigation outcomes that stay in the host country. And here, of course, the discussion is very much linked with the OMG discussion and safeguarding environmental integrity. Isn't it the case that those uncounted mitigation outcomes are somehow or somewhat watering down the ambition at the one hand side, like technically speaking, but at the other hand side gives way and drives capacity within the countries to sort out the NDC package in the first place? So with this, maybe rather an observation, I'd like also to give the chance to the authors of the study. I don't want, I mean, it's clear I did not, I was not involved in this study. The study has been commissioned by Sweden and a couple of consultants have been working on it, and Annick Kohli from Infras is in a call, and Randall Spalding-Fletcher from Carbon Limits as well. And I'd like to open up maybe also to them. Annick, maybe you want to give a reaction on that, on both the panelists and maybe also my observation about watering down the ambition by not counting the mitigation outcomes. Would you be available, Annick?
Yeah.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I was not expecting to take the floor, but I was carefully listening to what the previous speaker said. It was generally very interesting to see how well the report is received and that it has been read and studied carefully. I think it achieved, or the report achieved, what one of its intention was, to set out the options, and some of them are more practical, others might need a bit more time. And as was emphasized in the discussion before, and what we highlighted also in the report, it's not one or the other, that it's really a question also of combining, and it depends very much on the countries that are involved, what the backgrounds they are, and so I think that I just want to highlight that again, that it's not in the end that one option is better than the other. And of course, each option again has a certain bandwidth for how to actually implement it. So this paper just set out various options. On your concrete question, I'm not sure if I really understood what you meant, because you were saying that by not counting mitigation outcomes, you actually measured water down the ambition. Isn't it the other way around? By not using all the mitigation outcomes that you achieve, you want to increase actually overall ambitions. I'm not sure I got the questions.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's about corresponding adjustment. Is the corresponding adjustment applied to all mitigation outcomes, or only to transacted outcomes. Because I mean, the emission reduction or reductions in emission levels, they are reflected in the NDC reporting towards the target. And if, I mean, the host country gets it for free, and this is not climate finance. So maybe I'm wrong in my thinking, and I wouldn't. Maybe we can have a bilateral on that. I wouldn't.
Yeah. No, I mean, we have also, or there are also these discussions out of to what extent can you use Article 6 or let's say the line between Article 6 and climate financing, where to draw it and what is what. But I'm not sure if we should open the discussion here.
Maybe not. Yeah.
But
Because,
I'm sure that Randall has also
yeah, exactly.
some views. If he's still in the call.
Yeah. Randall?
Misha, sorry, if this is Juan Pedro, I have to leave.
Okay, Juan Pedro.
I'm sorry for
So,
that.
That's okay. And
okay,
thank you very much. It was very interesting, and hope we can continue the discussion at some
Super,
point.
yes.
And
Yeah. So I just want to react very quickly, and then I will leave. I'm afraid. So in terms of watering down the ambition, if you look at the long run mitigation goal, then it doesn't make any sense for countries to water down the ambition. So that's why the importance of analyzing Article 6 in this, overall context of carbon neutrality, and that makes a difference. But I mean, this doesn't preclude that we can understand better all these options and maybe apply them, but always thinking on the next NDC and carbon neutrality. And it will be interesting maybe in future work to understand the role of Article 6 and all these strategies in a negative world in terms of emissions. Because that's an interesting also part of the equation, because it's not just about reaching the point of carbon neutrality or net zero, but it's how you keep it over time. So that's so sorry I have to leave.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's also very good input for the end to think.
Okay, so thank you, and I hope to exchange in future events, and we can also have a bilat on the paper itself.
Okay, excellent.
So goodbye. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Okay, now Randall. Sorry.
hey, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I'm first of all just very delighted to see people talking about this. It's really, it's pretty rare you write something that more than 10 people read. So I mean, I assume we must have had like 50 people read it. So that's very good. Just a couple of quick things. I mean, we have to remind ourselves also, why is this important? Is that the market's job is to find the lowest cost abatement opportunities. And it did that extremely effectively in the CDM, right? Even with all of its problems. So we need to remember that like this will definitely be an issue, right? It's not like it might be an issue, it will definitely be an issue. So, we're trying to create the most productive way to address that. Second thing I would say, and I think touched on this, is the strategy, the practical choices depend very much on what information the host country has available, right? If you have no mitigation analysis at all, well, you should probably start out with sharing mitigation outcomes, maybe 50-50 or something like that, something very conservative, at least for the first couple of years, but hopefully you can then improve that. When Juan Pedro mentioned about this issue of something like renewable power, so we have worked on a pilot where we took this idea of kind of penetration levels, and could we kind of say, okay, if the NDC goal is to get to point A, then to get from point A to point B in that same project area could still be an Article 6 activity. So I think there are practical ways of doing that, but probably only in sectors that are relatively large, homogeneous, etc. And maybe the last thing I'll just say is, I mean, I think Urs brought up a really important point, but I think conceptually we need to get our minds around, is Article 6 to help you achieve your NDC, or is it to help you go beyond it? I would actually say the latter. I mean, I think there are spillover effects into the former, right? Because I do think Article 6 activity can help you improve your MRV systems. There are a lot of things it can do that will support that. But Misha's question about watering down, that all has to do with where the emission reduction is coming from. If we're using the methodological tools to identify emission reductions that are beyond the unconditional commitments, then sharing those is okay, right? Sharing those doesn't water anything down, because the host country is keeping something that means even their emissions balance will be farther along than their original NDC goal. So yeah, I think that's an important issue just to kind of keep in mind. But actually doing this, and really, we need more country experience to say, what does this mean in terms of the baseline of a specific project? How does that work? So, but thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's thank you for I think there is quite for me quite a clear takeaway in terms of yeah, I mean, along the lines of the observation I made before. It will take time. We're required to find the sweet spots at the time being to structure Article 6 transactions that meet the expectations and all the different requirements to go ahead. Ultimately, there needs to be an authorization by the host country. So all involved sides, project developer, transferring country, and buying country need to be comfortable with the setup, and this setup can be very, very custom tailored, involving very specific considerations about the baseline, about remaining mitigation outcomes, about capacity built up to be used later on. I think piloting is the word to be used here, and we are happy to provide our share going forward with that. We reached the close of 1 hour. Maybe take one question or just look at the Padlet. I see that you won't be able to read it on the screen that I shared. There are some contributions. One comment on the pricing in reserve action at marginal costs, about the question how the money would be used in 10 years time by governments. I think I have to review it afterwards, and I will share as well the material on the website. Maybe you can go and visit it afterwards and check the responses here. Then I would call this webcast to a close. We will share all the links as well for the study and the Padlet and the webcast afterwards. Starting next week, you will be able to retrieve the information. And with that, I thank all the participants, specifically to the panelists, and as well Annick and Randall for their ad hoc input. And yeah, wish you all a good rest of the day or good night. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, Michel. Bye-bye.
Bye.